Today I'm going to go over more history that impacts Night. Um, and so this is a pre-war map of the Jewish population around 1933 before World War II started. And if you look at the map, there's really not that many Jews in Europe at this time. Poland has 3 million, which is the most, and the Soviet Union, which is now known as Russia, has 2.5 million. But if you'll recall in your history classes, Hitler blamed Jews for the economic crisis and downfall of Germany. If you look at it, there was barely 500,000 Jews in Germany in that time. Very, very few compared to the entire population of Germany. So it's clearly a lie about him blaming Jews for Germany's problems at that time. As you can see, the total population in Europe is not even 10 million. And again, you can see the population more closely in Germany. The dots represent communities that had more than 10,000 Jews. So it's not that many. Okay, so there are some cliches and stereotypes about Jews. And so one is that Jews lived in a shtetl, which is a small Jewish town formerly found in Eastern Europe. So the Fiddler on the Roof clip that you just watched is an example of that. So even though not everyone lived in one, it was an important part of Jewish culture that no longer exists because it was wiped out by the Holocaust. Tradition was very important, part of shtetl life. And it emphasized the traditional roles of men and women in the household, arranged marriages, the importance of the synagogue and the community, and their beliefs about death. The marketplace was another large component of shtetl life and served as a gathering place. So, like any ethnic group or country, this is a cultural importance to Jews. So life in Western or Central Europe. Basically, they were assimilated into the towns and cities in which they lived, similarly to how we are today, where if you go to church or synagogue or a mosque, or if you don't practice, it doesn't really impact other people around you. It's accepted, right? And they practice their religion with varying degrees of observance. So just like how some Christians go to church every weekend, others only go on Christmas and Easter, and some go maybe quarterly. So it was the same thing with Jews. Sometimes they went to synagogue every week, and other times they didn't really practice. Sometimes they just did things at home, or they might not have. So they had various occupations. They served in the military in World War I. Jewish children went to public schools, and as you saw in the picture earlier this week, Jews didn't necessarily have brown hair and brown eyes or a certain face shape or any certain feature. They could have blonde hair, red hair, they could be tall, short, fat, thin. Like it didn't matter. So again, families, so like if you were Jewish, you could hang out with Jewish people or Christian people, Muslim people, atheists, it didn't matter. So it was kind of accepting of everyone. So they were a small percent of the population. For example, less than 1% of the German population in 1933. So even though they were such a small population, spread out usually, they had a rich culture and vibrant traditions. In Eastern Europe, that's where the majority of Jews lived before World War II, and that's where the shetls were. Some Jews lived in larger cities and assimilated to some degrees, but they didn't have as many freedom and rights in Eastern Europe, so they could be discriminated against in Eastern Europe. I'm sure there was anti-Semitism in Central and Western Europe and in the United States and anywhere. Even today, there's anti-Semitism. Just a few years ago in Flagstaff, people deface the new synagogue that was built by NAU. And so it doesn't matter where you live. If you're Jewish, in all probability, you will experience anti-Semitism, even now. Even though we've had decades to teach the Holocaust, it's terrifying because 2/3 of young adults didn't know that 6 million Jews died in the Holocaust. So I take this unit that I'm teaching you guys very, very seriously because you need this education. So Jews participated in sports, they went to public school, they participated in organizations, and again, they had a thriving social life, thriving culture, even though there was anti-Semitism. So this is 1950. This is about 5 years after World War II ended, and you can see Poland went from having 3 million Jews to 45,000. Luckily, the Soviet Union only lost 500,000, which is a better loss than Germany, or than Poland, although it's still a lot. Germany went down to 37,000. Spain lost 1,000. So you can see a lot were taken. A lot of lives were lost. And I take this unit very seriously as well because my grandfather was a Holocaust survivor and 80 members of my family died in the Holocaust. And not only did Nazis kill Jews, but they erased the records of Jews from cities and countries. And so I don't even know the names of the relatives that I lost in the Holocaust because the records are gone. I can't, like, even the synagogues were destroyed along with their records. And so it's really sad that not only were these people murdered, but you can't even find their names. And so if your family members forgot what they're, who died in the Holocaust, then they were literally erased from history, which is really, really sad. It's devastating. So this is a little video on anti-Semitism. And hopefully you guys can see it. I'll put the subtitles on.
It would be a grave mistake to view anti-Semitism as something that merely affects the Jewish people. Anti-Semitism is a form of discrimination against citizens that affects all of us. You do see anti-Semitism correlating with an intolerance generally. That is fundamentally going to constitute a threat to the kind of discourse and tolerance that are the bedrock of our democracies.
Historians of anti-Semitism have long argued that anti-Semitism, it begins with the Jews but it never ends with the Jews. It transcends place, it transcends nationality. We can document anti-Semitic attacks through the Middle Ages, and we can document them certainly in the 20th century, and now we can document them in the 21st century. It has legs that I think other hatreds haven't had.
Unfortunately, we are facing in Europe, all over Europe, a very strong resurgence of anti-Semitism.
Anti-Semitism today is fundamentally different than what it was before the Holocaust because it is not perpetrated by governments. Even if some of the stereotypes and prejudices are those we know for centuries.
The problem is that in our Muslim communities in Europe, we have a few thousand of radicalized youth. These jihadists are rabidly anti-Semitic. We never know whether they are going to cross the red line of terrorism, and some do. Often their targets are Jewish institutions or Jews.
We see across Europe an increase of right-wing extremist parties. These parties are not anymore considered as being on the fringe of society. And their messages, their ideologies are more and more seen as something that is acceptable.
Sometimes it's camouflaged by we don't want those who are different, a general anti-immigrant, anti-minority view.
You have as well a new form of anti-Semitism that is closely linked with anti-Zionism and hostility towards Israel. There is legitimate criticism of the policies of Israel, but there is a fine line that some people cross very easily between criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism.
Where it gets very problematic is when one starts to hear that the state of Israel doesn't have the right to exist, when one starts to hear Israelis or Israel itself being demonized, and the concerted effort to delegitimate the state and the people. That is anti-Semitism.
I think that most of the anti-Semitism in the Middle East is misinformed. It is to group people against a common enemy.
Holocaust denial is a form of anti-Semitism. The only reason to deny the Holocaust is to inculcate and foster anti-Semitism. One place where hardcore denial is very much in vogue is in the Middle East. The audience often are anti-Semites who are looking to have their feelings confirmed, or people who might not be overt anti-Semites, but somehow are discomforted with the idea of Jew as victim.
I think for anyone, anti-Semitism should be an important topic and subject. If it's going on in Pakistan, it should be important to someone living in Kansas City. We are a connected global community.
If you leave anti-Semitism unresponded to by law enforcement, by governments, by political leaders, then you send this message that it's tolerated, that it's completely accepted.
What you're seeing now is states, at least in Europe, where there's been the biggest upsurge, seeking to combat those crimes. More needs to be done.
We'll stand together against discrimination against minority, or Christian, or anti-Semitism. We stand together shoulder to shoulder because our religion, all of us, call us to stand as one family.
It is extremely important that parts of our society that aren't themselves being targeted by anti-Semitism see this as a warning. When anti-Semitic discrimination or violent acts happen, it is a threat to liberal society, and citizens around the world have an interest in thwarting it and in speaking out against it.
Recent threats targeting Jewish community centers and vandalism of Jewish cemeteries, as well as last week's shooting in Kansas City, remind us that we are a country that stands united in condemning hate and evil in all of its very ugly forms.
There's a well-worn tradition in most societies of marginalizing the other. Xenophobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism starts as rhetoric, very quickly migrates to discrimination, and can result in violence. It is extremely important that parts of our society that aren't themselves being targeted by anti-Semitism see this as a warning. When anti-Semitic discrimination or violent acts happen, it is a threat to liberal society.
So as you guys can see, anti-Semitism is happening all over the world and even in Flagstaff. And as they mentioned, it's whenever a marginalized group has hate crimes against them. And so I think you can easily look in the news and see where there was a hate crime even in the United States. And so you really need to think hard. You might disagree with how someone lives, but is that enough to commit a crime over, or should you have a conversation to understand where that person is coming from?